Welcome to ETM Analytics' Politics Fix podcast. I'm joined by independent political analyst Melanie Verwoerd, of course, former ambassador and MP as well. Melanie, thank you very much for joining me again today. Obviously, the big domestic political story of this past week came out of this weekend's ANC conference, where you had leaders like Ramaphosa asking the councillors to step up. You almost get the sense that the ANC is kind of trying to rally their local councillors, realizing that, a straightforward PR campaign is really not going to cut it to pull them out of the support slump. They're going to, quite honestly, just start doing the work properly that they've been appointed to. But there's, of course, a couple of weeks ago, I'm sure you saw the headlines that went around on News 24. We had it in Business Day and a couple of other publications that it was a DA poll. I need to underscore that, a DA poll that stated that the ANC was going to crash, as some headlines put it, below 30% for the ANC in support. Is there any merit in that claim? Because it came out of the DA camp, I was already a bit skeptical about that claim.
So a few points to be made on this. The first thing, let's just talk about the ANC for a moment. Of course, that's what they're doing. They know that our biggest challenge. So they are in trouble, know that. So they know that what they need to do is, do something very dramatic in the next, most probably year. I mean, the question is, when will they have local government elections? Their constitution says 5 years, and then it dissolves, and then you have 90 days. And so, on average, what we've seen is 5 years and 3 months. It was just under since we started doing local government elections. However, our last election was on November 2021. And so it is, strictly speaking, it can go until the end of January 2027. But then you're going into the summer holidays, and also you're going to into that beginning January, going back to school, chaos and so on. So most probably not. Most bosses are working on the end of November. I think it's important that we then also look at what makes good political polling. I mean, we're a big country, 66 million people, 16 million plus registered voters. That's a lot, and we're geographically very big. So when you do political polling, you need to make sure that your sample size is big enough. So I think if you go way below 4,000, then you need to get close to the 4,000 mark to be really a good sample size. Of course, it needs to be representative in terms of age, gender, race, class, etc., but also in terms of geography, which makes local government polling almost impossible because we have got so many local councils and it differs so dramatically all over the country. It's better to do a face-to-face poll. People tend to lie over the phone and they get suspicious, so they're trying to figure out what you want to do. Again, if you're going to do that on local government level, it's basically impossible, too big. And then, of course, you need to take turnout into account, and you have to look at how big the error margin is. If an error margin goes beyond sort of 4-5%, then you have to ask how useful the poll is. Now, if we look at that DA poll that was leaked, we have to say it was leaked. The DA does tracking polls. So that means it's either daily or weekly tracking polls. I'm not 100% sure what this one was. But it's exactly that. It's just a small little sample size on that particular day. And that's why it's called a tracking poll, because you need to do averages. You can't just take that day's one because it suits you and then you release that to the media and say that's now something that's valid. A tracking poll is exactly that. You need to get an average because it's always done by phone because they're doing it so frequently. You can't, face-to-face polls are very labor intensive and they only get done very rarely. So if you're going to do a phone poll, you might have just on that day found all the housewives of Pretoria at home at that particular time you were phoning. And then you're going to get a very particular sample. Or the next day, you might only find a certain amount of people in the rural areas in KwaZulu-Natal at home. So, that's why you can never take a tracking poll, just one sample, and then extrapolate that for the rest of the country, etc. Also, that was a smallish sample size because it's a tracking poll. It was just over 1,800. And the error margin, self-declared, was around 4%. So even Helen Zille said, no, man, you can't take too much around that. That's not a valid poll. But what happened then is that a lot of people, especially in the financial sector, and I got queried, attacked when I didn't believe it, or I said it wasn't, I think, a realistic scenario from both overseas and here by financial sector, where people started saying, well, they think there's a very high likely scenario, and I think this poll played into it, that given the way the ANC is declining, which they are, that come the next national election in 2029, that the DA, together with the Patriotic Alliance, which everybody believes will be growing, and they are growing, and then maybe with the IFB, can actually get a majority and then control the government of national unity. So after I got numerous sort of people saying that to me, I thought, let me actually do some modeling and have a proper look at the modeling, what will happen. Now, we have to say it's early days. There's a lot of ifs when you do this kind of modeling. Um, so one needs to be, very careful. And these are just scenarios that I was checking to see, is that even possible? And the preconditions that I worked on was that same turnout, so around 58%, and same amount of voters, which they won't be. There will be more. But I worked on the same amount of voters just to make it roughly, easier to work on. So in the first scenario, the ANC drops to 35%, so from 41 to 35. The DA rises to 25%, so roughly about 4% up. MK goes up to 20% because they are growing. So that's almost 6% or 5.5% up for them. EFF, I've kept at the same level just because the opinion polls that we do have doesn't show that they're growing at the moment. It actually shows they're declining a bit. IFP, I've kept at the same level, just under 4%, because they've been consistent at that level for very, very long. And then I doubled, because that's what people kept saying to me that might happen, the Patriotic Alliance, to 4%. What happens then is that all the other parties together, who's currently sitting at 8%, then drops to about just under 3%, which most probably is not very realistic, but let's keep it at that. What would happen in that case scenario, so ANC at 35, DA at 25, MK at 20, and Patriotic Alliance doubles to 4%, the rest stays the same, roughly, is that the ANC is 140 seats. The DA and the Patriotic Alliance together gets 116, so not close. The people who've put these scenarios to me then seems to think the IFP will come in with the DA and the Patriotic Alliance, which I doubt, but let's assume for the sake of argument they might. That gives them 131 together. And then if you take all the others, which would never happen, but all the others now of the smaller parties, so not EFF and MK, if you put them together as well with the IFB, the Patriotic Alliance, and the DA, they come to 142. And remember, the ANC had 140 in this scenario. So 2 votes above the ANC. That's not enough. It's the same problem the ANC has at the moment if the DA is not there. They just have a majority of 1 then, or an absolute majority of 1 then, and that's not enough. You can never work like that. It's just too many people are sick, dead, or something, that happens. But what you have in that scenario, and that the same thing happens if the ANC drops to 30%. It's a bit easier then for the DA, together with those other parties, to get more than the ANC. But in both scenarios, whether the ANC falls to 30 or whether the ANC falls to 35, and with all those preconditions that I built in, no party gets an outright majority. So everybody sits somewhere. In the one, the ANC still has the majority of votes, but not an outright majority. In the other one, the DA might have more than the ANC if they get all those other parties together, but still not an outright majority. And now you're having a Joburg scenario, the local government Joburg scenario, where everything can sort of just freeze. Because either now the DA has to work with the EFF and MK, which both sides says they won't, or the ANC has to work with EFF and MK, which I know the markets will not like. So it's not a great space to be in. So people who get very excited about this, careful what you wish for. It's messy. It's really messy. And the other thing that I just want to say, in both of those scenarios, for the DA to get to 25%, they have to get an additional roughly around 400,000 votes. Now, in the last election, they dropped in real terms. They got more seats because of the proportionality and turnout. But in real terms, they actually dropped by more than 300,000 votes. Interestingly enough, the Patriotic Alliance got just over 300,000 votes. So you can see the Patriotic Alliance is taking DA votes. And And so for them to actually get an additional 400,000 is going to be very challenging for them. And in my scenario, I already gave them half of the ANC votes, which is unlikely to happen. It will most probably go MK. I gave the other half to the MK. And the ones that the ANC lost. And if you then say 400,000 extra, but the Patriotic Alliance is also now doubling, so they're getting another 300,000. So actually, and those votes will come from the DA largely. They won't come from anywhere else. So largely, the DA will then have to get somewhere around 700,000 votes extra. Very unlikely. So I think all this sort of, I just wanted to do it in numbers, not only in saying unlikely DA polling, that kind of thing. It's not impossible that the DA gets together with coalition partners can get more than the ANC, but it's going to be an incredible difficult fight. And that's on national level. If we're looking at local government level, you have to drill it down. You have to look at individual metros because people vote very differently at local government. Personalities get involved, personal local issues get involved. So it's much more difficult to do that kind of thing on a local level.
Yeah, like you mentioned, Joburg and how it's going there. When it comes to local elections, it's a very risky business because it's very much a scenario of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, and ideology is often left at the door. I remember I was still a journalist at the time. I don't know if you remember the dramatic politics of Nelson Mandela Bay in 2090. It's worth writing a telenovela, by the way, about what happened there. But back there, in 2018, the UDN had 2 seats. Sounds right. At the mayor, and it helped the mayoral chain in Nelson Mandela Bay. It was under Obubane, unfortunately. He's passed away now. But, it just shows how quickly local governments can get warped. Because unlike the GNU, where there's some interplay of ideology coming in, there is a much more power play. And like you mentioned, personalities and egos and power taking. It's not so structured. And that to me is concerning because that is what destabilizes local governments. And we see this in real time in several metros currently playing out across the country. And when that just the more unstable these municipalities become, that it has implications for manufacturing, for business, for growth, for the fiscus. It can put pressures on, obviously, and we can, it will likely lead to, further debt for the government increasing. But the problem we'll also have, Melanie, is that when this happens, and this has been happening and it's been a trend, that as these governments continue to fail, voters become disenfranchised. And they kind of start stepping away from the voting box more and more. And that's a trend that we struggle to buck. And that to me, that's why I'm highlighting the local government elections as a risk factor, because at a local level, it could lead to further social unrest. If there's more coalitions and unstable coalitions, it has the possibility of driving away voters even further, or making them feel kind of powerless. And that to me is concerning when we start looking at local government elections next year.
Well, totally. And, Nelson Mandela Bay, it got worse. Remember that then, I think it was in 2019, a guy called Buyeye from the IRC. Yeah, and you remember in Johannesburg, the Al Jamal Party twice held the mayorship. And they had, it was a disaster. It really was. And yes, the problem is, and I think a lot of the difficulty that certainly the ANC has at the moment on national level has got to do with the lack of service delivery at a local level. It's because local government is falling apart. It's not actually because ultimately what people want is water, electricity, and yes, local clinics and so on, and things working. But if you don't have the basic services like water and electricity, that's step one, and that's all falling apart. And so if you can visibly see literally things around you falling apart, or your water gets contaminated, or you don't have water, it's a disaster, So, and I do think, it is very concerning if, and particularly younger voters, is apathy towards elections. We know that the post-1994 generation is still not really voting, and that's concerning because they should be voting by now, if you take international norms. And you don't want that. You don't, because if you don't take out your grievances at the ballot box, you're going to take it out at some point somewhere else. And you don't want that to happen, because that's dangerous, particularly in our country with the level of poverty and frustration levels that can rise very quickly. I mean, I think what is helpful is maybe to just have a little look at the different metros, if you'd like me to do that.
Yeah, I know she said it's difficult to kind of test on it
And be very vague at this stage. I mean, most probably anybody can work this out. But, I think in Johannesburg, of course, what's happening in Johannesburg at the moment is the big story is the fact that Helen Zille is now the mayoral candidate for the DA. It's not been officially announced, but I think it's a given that that's going to happen. Which I don't particularly think is a bad thing for the country. I actually think it's maybe good that she's rather at local level instead of saying all kind of controversial things at a national level, which puts the GNU constantly under strain. It certainly annoys the ANC endlessly. Um, but the question is, will that be enough? Certainly the DA will not get an outright majority in Johannesburg. And I mean, this is the thing with our situation in South Africa, because elections are still so racially connected to the parties, in particular, it's so, specific. If you just look at the demographics, you can sort of predict what will happen and people who think that the townships en masse is now going to turn ANC because the DA is doing well in the Western Cape. Yeah, no, it's not even happening in the Western Cape. So I don't think that's going to happen. So I don't think in Johannesburg they will get any party again will get an outright majority. I think what will most probably happen what is hopeful is that perhaps the ANC and the DA combined will now get a bigger majority to stabilize the whole situation in Johannesburg. And then one would have to see. I mean, Helen Zille can be abrasive, trying to find a diplomatic word, abrasive. And that kind of thing always is more problematic. There's less capacity to absorb it, less resilience. So one would just have to hope that on a local level that can be managed, so that it doesn't keep on breaking out, because that's what's so destabilizing, of course. I think Tshwane, again, no outright majority. But most probably the DA couldn't hold it again by just making coalitions with parties. Most probably the same thing will happen in Kuruleni. Buffalo City, I think the ANC will hold. The DA will definitely hold Cape Town Metro. The bigger question is going to be, what is the Patriotic Alliance going to do in the rural areas of the Western Cape? That's a challenging one, and I know the DA is very worried about that. Nelson Mandela Bay, I think, will remain a bit of a messy situation. Again, I don't think there'll be an outright majority at the moment. The DA and the ANC has the same amount of seats, so that's why they're doing funny things. So we'll have to see what happens there. I think the ANC will do worse, but the question is, where do people then go if do they not vote at all? Do they go to other smaller parties? And I think the idea that en masse people will move to the DA is most probably not realistic. But I think the question is then, where do they go? And then the big question is going to be eThekwini, Durban, of course. We'll have to see what MK does. And I think that's going to be very interesting, because one would guess that MK will grow greatly there.
I'm assuming that they will stand in the local elections, and that will be their first local elections. They've only done national, so it's going to be interesting to see how they fare, right?
Absolutely, and I have no doubt that they will stand definitely en masse in KwaZulu-Natal. That's going to be their power base, and that is their power base, is local communities in KwaZulu-Natal. I mean, if you look at the electoral map that the IEC does every year after every election with the colors, if you look at the 2019 versus the 2020, this is now national 2024 national elections, and you look at KwaZulu-Natal, so on the map, the ANC is green, and IFP is sort of a fleshy color, and MK is dark pink. So in 2019, you get green and fleshy color. So IFP, ANC, that's basically it. A little bit of dots, but nothing really dramatic. If you look at the next election, virtually no green, a little bit at the southern point, so virtually no ANC, and all dark pink and the fleshy IFP color. It's very dramatic. If you actually go and look at that, well, political nerds like me find that very interesting and very dramatic. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, go look at the electoral maps. It's super interesting to see, and it's very visual, that dramatic shift that happened in KwaZulu-Natal. And I'm sure MK will stand at a local level. Question, of course, if they have enough money to do it. Local governments are incredibly expensive, because the parties have to be in so many places, different posters, different. It's a very big challenge for parties, local government elections financially. But I'm guessing they'll figure it out. Yeah.
They always somehow do, right? You don't have to apologize, political nerd and maths. I mean, we're finance people, and so we stare at charts. So I think we have some shared interest there when looking at these developments. And I know it's still early days, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be an interesting ride all the way through to local elections, likely in November. A lot of water that can still run under the bridge. There's a lot of politics at play. There's the ANC, there's the investigations from the US with the links to Iran. You've got that developments happening on the side. You've got some internal developments within the ANC, some struggles as well. So I think there's a lot of moving parts, and we have to keep track of that. But it's also good. Thank you for reminding us to just sometimes just keep a level head about this. Do the simple math and think about this logically, as opposed to just grabbing onto headlines and creating these scenarios that not impossible, but definitely a tall order for the DA to get all the way through.
Very. And the big question is going to be, from an ANC perspective, can they pull anything out of the hat in the next year that can make a big difference, a massive difference to the actual quality of life for voters? Even if they can't do it at a local level, I'm going to be challenging to do that. But can they do some really interesting things on a national level?
I'm going to remain pessimistic if you allow me. Because since 1994, there's not really been, and I mean, even under the Cyril Ramaphosa presidency, we've just not seen the structural reforms to the financial markets, and manufacturers and businesses have been calling for happening. Even now with the GNU, some people are complaining this is taking too long and we need to get a move on. There are specs. Let's just give credit where credit is due with Transnet, for example. So there are specs. But let's see. I think pulling out a rabbit out of the hat for the ANC to just turn their fortunes around. Yeah.
And do you remember, those are not necessarily the Transnet, yes, Eskom, yes, but a lot of the things that people always hold, when I speak to financial people, what they think are very important steps to be taken, yes, might grow the economy over the long term, but it's not going to do it in a year. And secondly, often the things that they bring up are not the things that the ANC voters are necessarily interested in, right? So yes, long-term growth, but if you're talking about a year from now, the things that are important to historically ANC voters are not necessarily those things. And so you'd also have to remember that the ANC is going to focus on the things that are important to their voters, which is now increasingly rural, poor voters with an emphasis on women as well. So you have to always keep that in mind. And then the question for the DA is, a big question is what's going to happen at their election next year for their party leadership. So if Helen is going to stand as the mayor of Joburg, then she can't be the federal chair anymore. But the names that are mentioned are again mostly white men. It's not exclusively. The deputy minister of finance is also being mentioned. But if the point is, if you really want to get growth, 700,000 votes or 400,000 votes, you have to somehow get into the townships more. And if you don't change the profile and the look of your leadership, and I mean, it's frustrating, I know, that we're not yet at the phase where that doesn't matter, but it still matters greatly in our country. And so, if John Steenhuisen, like it looks, will be re-elected because he's standing now again, and you don't get your federal chair right, so it's the two prominent faces, the likelihood of the DA growing exponentially, even if they can take every single Freedom Front Plus votes, they only got about 280,000 in the last election, it was over that. Even if they can take every single Freedom Front vote, it's going to be very challenging for them to get the kind of numbers and growth numbers, especially if the Patriotic Alliance grows significantly, to actually increase to even 25%, never mind to the numbers which they are talking, which were rumored, close to 30%. I think that's practically impossible. They would have to do we would have to see a massive shift in the South African landscape for that to happen.
Yeah, I seem to agree. See, the DA and their leadership and how they're going to have to look at this from a strategic perspective. Nothing more into that, just from a strategic perspective. It's something they're going to have to consider. Melanie, we can talk about this for a very long time, but we have to catch up more, and we'll do so as we lead into 2026. We'll keep everyone abreast in scenarios and risk planning around it. But of course, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Melanie, thank you very much for your insights, and we are chatting.